Since its invention in the early 19th century, the camera has remained one of the most loved and used inventions to this day. However, just because a picture tells 1,000 words, that doesn't mean it always tells a happy story. Welcome back everyone, my name is Kennedy, and today on Most Amazing we are taking a look at some creepy and some seemingly innocent photos that all have one thing in common. So get ready, because this is the top 10 historic photos that hide a dark story. Starting us off at number 10, Mokomokai. Long before the interference of European colonists, the Maori people of New Zealand showcased status through a practice called tamoka, which are facial tattoos. These tattoos not only marked a rite of passage, but also signified rank, lineage, and occupation, and were a highly respected and sacred practice. Now, when someone with Moko passed away, either naturally or through battle, they would sever the head from the fallen body and preserve it by boiling it, smoking it, drying it out, and finally dipping it in shark oil. If the person had been killed by a warring tribe, it was kept as a trophy. However, in other cases, families would keep the heads of their fallen loved ones, treasuring them and only bringing them out for sacred ceremonies. Now, the reason I say all of this is because at first glance, you kind of assume that this guy sitting in front of all these mummified heads was the one to have been responsible. But that's not the case. This man here, Major General Horatio Gordon Robley, served with the British Army during the 1860s and was but one of the soldiers to pillage and steal the heads right out from under Maori people. Disgustingly, he then tried to sell the stolen artifacts back to the New Zealand government. However, they ended up being displayed at the American Museum of Natural History instead. Coming in at number 9, remains of an astronaut. Infamously known as the man who fell from space, Vladimir Komarov was a famous Russian astronaut, or cosmonaut as they were called, during the Cold War space race. In 1967, he embarked on a crazy mission that, although he was completely trained to complete, was ultimately rushed. Allegedly, the spacecraft had a multitude of structural issues, and despite engineers warning the Soviet officials that the craft was not ready, they continued with the mission as planned. So Vladimir took off and made his way up into the eternity of space, and even executed 16 orbits around Earth. But along the line, something went awry with his mission, so he was instructed to make his way back down to Earth. However, things went south upon trying to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere when his parachute would not engage, and Vladimir plummeted back towards the Earth, crashing in a horrific explosion. Rumor has it that while he was plummeting to his fate, he was screaming at the Soviets for forcing him to do this mission. All that remained of him is what you see here. Next up at number 8, Radium Girls. After its discovery in 1898, radium quickly became one of the hottest things on the market. By 1914, the United States Radium Corporation began developing a special glow-in-the-dark paint using radium, which was mainly used for watches they would send off to soldiers during the war. However, the corruption began after they started hiring young female workers to use said paint to make these radium dials, but despite having an understanding of the harm it could inflict, they did nothing to warn these women, nor did they provide them physical protection from the substance. In fact, they actually assured them that the paint was harmless, and more so, instructed the women to make a point out of the brushes with their lips to keep the fine tip for the watches. So the women in each facility began unknowingly ingesting copious amounts of radium, and the process became known as lip dip paint. And some of the girls even began to paint their fingernails, face, and teeth with the stuff, as once again, they had been told it was completely harmless. However, as we know now, that was far from the case, and tragically, many of these Radium Girls, as they were later coined, either died from the exposure or at the very least suffered extensive poisoning. Tragically, little did the women in this photo know they were already dying a slow and painful death. Coming in at number 7, Mary Reeser. On the morning of July 2nd, 1951, in St. Petersburg, Florida, Mary Reeser's landlady went up to the old woman's apartment to deliver a telegram. But upon her arrival, noticed something strange, that her door was warm to the touch. Still, she opened it nervously, and to her horror, she found Mary almost completely reduced to a pile of ashes on her chair with only a small part of her left leg and her shockingly shrunken skull remaining. But what exactly happened to Mary? Well, that's kind of the million-dollar question. Local authorities were unable to determine the cause of the fire as the rest of the apartment was relatively unscathed. And when the FBI became involved, they determined Mary had essentially gone up in flames like the wick of a candle while her own body fat fed the flame. But still, the question of how the fire started in the first place remained unanswered. Often referred to as the Cinder Lady, there was a theory at the time that Mary suffered spontaneous human combustion, but whatever it was that happened certainly left a terrifying crime scene. Coming in at number 6, 19th century cure for mental illness. Over the years, there have been countless terrible ideas related to the cure for mental illness. In the early to mid 1900s, for example, the lobotomy was a popular method to fix the issue. At other points in time, they believed removing a part of the skull could do the trick. Prior to this, it was common practice to generate a near-death incident like drowning, while of course back before the idea of depression or other mental illnesses were truly understood as a concept, it was believed to be a demon, and a good old exorcism was the way to go. However, there is one practice I had never even heard of until I saw this photo from 1890. As you can see here, this photo shows a woman being held up in a sort of crucifix pose and forced to face a wall. And after doing a bit of deep diving, it turns out this was a pretty standard practice in mental institutions in the 19th century. At the time, it was believed that this could cure what they referred to as insanity, although I don't know how any of these people thought forcing someone to stand while being chained up and staring into nothingness was going to help them feel better. I mean, if I didn't know any better, I would think this was some kind of evil prisoner. Just goes to show how corrupt and cruel asylums were back in the day. Coming in at number 5, the last public guillotine. I don't know about you, but I am always shocked when I remember that the last public execution via guillotine was in 1939. It just feels so medieval that I can't believe there are people alive today who could have witnessed such a thing happen. The man facing his death was named Eugene Weidman, and to be fair, he was no peach. Convicted for kidnapping and killing multiple men and women, but even so, it's wild to me that this photo is less than 85 years old. According to news articles from the time, the crowd went wild when he was brought out of the prison and towards the giant blade. Observers were reportedly hooting, hollering, and whistling during the event, even going so far as to dab up the dead man's blood with their handkerchiefs as a souvenir. After the event, authorities decided that what had long been intended to serve as a deterrent for bad behavior had turned into a rowdy, gladiator-type fest, and so France ultimately decided to outlaw public execution entirely. And speaking of people we know that witnessed such things, famous actor Christopher Lee, who played Saruman in Lord of the Rings, was apparently at this very execution. Coming in at number 4, hotel manager. At first glance, it's a bit tricky to tell what's going on in this photo. However, after doing a bit of searching around, the story behind it all is much darker than meets the eye. Taken during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, this image you are seeing here shows a group of both black and white folks enjoying a dip in the pool while the hotel manager is pouring some kind of liquid into the water. Now, before I get into what's happening in this photo, let me first explain what happened 7 days prior. So remember, at this time, segregation was still in full swing, and this hotel was whites only. Reportedly, a week before this photo was taken, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested for trespassing at this very hotel after being asked to leave from its segregated restaurant. Now, there were some people staying at this hotel who, rightfully so, thought this was not okay, and so the white guests invited black people to join them in the pool as their guests in an attempt to protest the segregation of the facility. However, the manager, Jimmy Brock, was not a fan of this protest, and in this photo here, you'll see he's pouring a bottle of hydrochloric acid into the pool to scare away the swimmers. Again, just another thing to add to the long list of atrocities committed to people of color in our world. Coming in at number 3, Blanch Monier. Born in 1849, Blanche Monier was a well-respected French socialite from a conservative bourgeoisie family. Acclaimed for astounding beauty, by her early 20s there were plenty of suitors who fancied her hand, and by 1876, at the age of 27, she finally found a man who she wished to marry. However, the man in question, a penniless lawyer, was not to her mother's liking, and so in a fit of disapproval, her mother decided to lock her daughter in a tiny dark room in the attic of their home, where poor Blanche remained hidden from sunlight and humanity for the next 25 years of her life. Now, beyond the obviously awful parts about this decision, her mother spent the next 25 years claiming her daughter was missing, playing the victim of a mourning mother. Meanwhile, with the help of her son and Blanche's brother Marcel, let her daughter literally rot, starve, and go mad in isolation. That was until May of 1901, when the Paris Attorney General received an anonymous letter revealing the location and depravity of Madame Monier's prisoner, and when the police arrived, they couldn't believe their eyes. As you can see in this photo, Blanche was in an unrecognizable state, covered in rotten food, her own feces, and weighing a mere 50 pounds. Police said the stench in that room was so vile they could barely stay long enough to get her out of there. In the end, Blanche was taken to live the rest of her life in a facility as she suffered extreme mental health disorders from the cruelties she experienced, though sadly justice was never really served. Her mother died shortly after she was found, and her brother was acquitted, as at the time, duty to rescue was not a part of the penal code. Coming in at number 2, rings. Starting in 1933 up until the end of World War II, we are all very well aware that the evil German party operated more than 1,000 camps and inflicted some of the most cruel, inhumane, and diabolical acts on millions of prisoners, especially targeting the Jewish population. Now, while this is by no means the most awful photo depicting this period in time, it does however showcase the gravity in a new light. This photo, dating back to May 5th, 1945, shortly after the defeat of the dictatorship, US troops stumbled across this giant box of wedding rings prisoners were forced to remove so that the party could repurpose the high-quality gold. Among these rings, they also found watches, eyeglasses, gold fillings that would have been extracted from the prisoners' teeth, and precious stones. And so while this photo may look rather innocent compared to some of the others on this list, it is in fact anything but. And last up in our number 1 spot, human zoos. It's no secret that humanity has done some incredibly messed up and cruel things through the years. War, genocide, slavery, to name a few. However, this photo dating back to 1904 shows yet another mind-boggling atrocity. As you can see, this photo shows what used to be an actual attraction at the Coney Island Zoo in the early 20th century, imprisoned Filipino people, which is beyond disgusting. Apparently, these attractions began in the late 19th century and were very popular up until the mid-1950s, as the Western world was desperate to see what at the time was viewed as a primitive and savage lifestyle. I know, it's gross. This one in particular was reportedly intended to show off the fact that the US had recently claimed the Philippines, and visitors would come by to watch the prisoners inside while throwing peanuts at them. Now, I should clarify, it was not just Coney Island doing this. Zoos containing captured indigenous peoples from Asian and African countries were very popular in other countries like France, England, Spain, Italy, as well as the United States. But either way, it's beyond revolting that this was a thing to begin with, let alone that it went on for so long. Well, that's all I've got for you today, guys. I hope you liked this video. If you did, you know what to do. Like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on the next one. And with that, I'll see you next time, friends.